In 1985, Steve Jobs got fired from Apple, the company he started in his parents' garage. 12 years later, they paid $400 million to buy him back. Here's what happened in between. December 20th, 1996. Apple headquarters Cupertino. Gil Amelio is sitting in his office staring at a balance sheet that makes him want to throw up. He's been CEO for exactly 1 year. In that year, Apple has lost $816 million, not revenue lost, actual cash bleeding out of the company. The stock is at $14. Analysts are writing obituaries. Michael Dell literally just said, and this is a real quote, "What would I do? I'd shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders." Amelio's got maybe 6 months before the board fires him, maybe less, and the problem isn't just money, it's that Apple doesn't have an operating system that works. They spent 8 years and $500 million trying to build one. It doesn't work, nothing works, they're shipping computers that crash constantly. Developers are abandoning the platform, and Microsoft, God, Microsoft is everywhere. Windows 95 is printing money. Bill Gates is worth $18 billion and climbing. Amelio's phone rings, it's his head of corporate development. "Gil, I think I found something. There's this company called NeXT. They've got an operating system. It's actually good, really good, and I think we can buy it." Amelio barely looks up. "Who runs it?" There's a pause. "Steve Jobs." Amelio drops his pen. Steve Jobs, the guy they fired, the guy who spent the last 11 years telling anyone who'd listen that Apple was doomed without him, the guy with the ego the size of California, that's Steve Jobs. "Set up a meeting," Amelio says. What happens over the next 365 days is the greatest comeback in business history. Not just Steve's comeback, Apple's. Because in December 1996, Apple is dying. By December 1997, Steve Jobs is back as CEO. And by December 1998, they've launched the iMac and everything has changed. This is the story of those 12 years, the wilderness years, what Steve Jobs did when nobody wanted him, how he came back, and why the revenge, the return, the resurrection of Steve Jobs might be the most important business story ever told. I'm Alex Morgan, this is Behind the Billion, and today we're breaking down 12 years of Steve Jobs' life that most people completely skip over. The exile years, 1985 to 1997. Everyone knows the highlights, right? Steve starts Apple, gets fired, comes back, saves the company, builds the iPhone, becomes a legend. But here's what nobody talks about, what actually happened during those 12 years he was gone. Because this isn't just a story about getting fired and coming back. This is a story about what you do when you lose everything. When the thing you built, the thing you named, the thing you poured your entire soul into kicks you out. When you're 30 years old and the world thinks you're done. I spent the last 10 days reading everything I could find about this period. I mean everything. Walter Isaacson's biography, all 656 pages, I read it twice. The Steve Jobs archive interviews, old magazine articles from 1985, financial filings from NeXT, interviews with people who worked with him, court documents, shareholder letters, and honestly, I could not stop reading. Because what Steve did during these years, the decisions he made, the bets he placed, it's all connected to why Apple became what it is today. So let me take you back to the beginning of the end, September 1985. Steve Jobs is 30 years old. He's worth $200 million on paper. He's on the cover of magazines. He's dating Joan Baez. He drives a Porsche with no license plate. And he just got fired from Apple Computer, the company he co-founded 9 years earlier in his parents' garage. Now, technically, he didn't get fired. That's not how it works when you're on the board of directors. Here's what actually happened. May 1985. Steve's been pushing this computer called the Macintosh. He's obsessed with it. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it's everything Steve thinks a computer should be, but there's a problem, it's not selling, it's too expensive, it's too slow, it doesn't have enough software, businesses won't buy it, and Apple is hemorrhaging cash. The board brings in this guy John Sculley as CEO. Steve recruited him personally from Pepsi with that famous line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Great line, legendary pitch. But here's the thing, Sculley actually wants to run the company, and Steve won't let him. They fight constantly in meetings, in front of employees, it gets personal. Steve thinks Sculley doesn't understand products. Sculley thinks Steve is reckless and immature, and finally in May 1985, it comes to a head. Steve tries to stage a coup, I'm not kidding. He literally tries to get the board to fire Sculley and make him CEO. He's flying around on weekends trying to get board members on his side. He's having secret meetings. He thinks he can pull it off. He can't. The board meets, they vote, and they strip Steve Jobs of all operational duties. He's still on the board, he's still a major shareholder, but he has zero power, no team, no projects, nothing. He's 30 years old and they've kicked him to the side. I read this interview where Steve described what that felt like. He said, "I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach and all the air had been knocked out of me. I was out, and I felt like I'd let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down. I was a very public failure." Think about that for a second, public failure, not just losing your job, losing your identity, because Steve Jobs was Apple. That's how everyone saw him. That's how he saw himself. So what does he do? Here's where the story gets interesting. Most people would retreat, right? Go quiet, lick their wounds, maybe start something small, something safe. Not Steve. Within 2 months, he's already planning his next move, and it's bold, borderline insane, actually. September 1985. Steve resigns from Apple officially, sells all his shares except one. He keeps one share just so he can go to shareholder meetings and ask difficult questions. And then he announces he's starting a new computer company. He's calling it NeXT. Get this, he takes 5 of Apple's best engineers with him, 5 people from the Mac team, just poaches them. Apple is furious. They sue him. They actually sue him for stealing their employees. The lawsuit alleges that Steve is using Apple's proprietary information, that he planned this while he was still on the board, that it's a betrayal. Steve doesn't care, he's already moving forward. Now here's what I found fascinating. I was reading through old articles from late 1985, and the tech press is obsessed with NeXT. Everyone's watching, everyone's wondering, can Steve do it again? Can he build another Apple? Businessweek runs this huge profile. The Wall Street Journal is covering every move, because remember, Steve is only 30 and he's already built a billion-dollar company, so maybe he can do it twice. Steve raises $7 million from a few rich people. Then, and this is wild, Ross Perot, that Ross Perot, the Texas billionaire who will later run for president, he sees Steve on a PBS documentary talking about NeXT. He's so impressed that he calls Steve and says, I want in. He invests $20 million. $20 million based on seeing Steve talk on TV for 10 minutes. So Steve's got funding, he's got a team, and he's got this vision for what NeXT is going to be. He wants to build the ultimate computer for universities, for researchers, for serious thinkers, not mass market, not consumer, something elite, something special. And he's going to do it the Steve Jobs way, which means perfect, obsessive, beautiful, expensive, really, really expensive. Let me paint you a picture of how Steve operated at NeXT, because this is important. NeXT headquarters, Palo Alto. They're designing the computer. Steve brings in this famous designer named Paul Rand, the guy who designed the IBM logo, the ABC logo, and pays him $100,000 just to design the NeXT logo. $100,000 for a logo. Keep in mind, the entire company has maybe 50 employees at this point. But it gets better. Steve decides the NeXT computer is going to be a perfect cube, not rectangular. A cube, 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot, perfectly symmetrical. Why? Because it looks beautiful. That's it. That's the reason. Never mind that it's harder to manufacture. Never mind that it limits the engineering. Steve wants a cube. Oh, and the factory. The factory Steve builds to manufacture these computers is insane. He spends $10 million on a factory that's supposed to be completely automated. Robots everywhere. He paints all the machines in specific colors. The walls have to be a specific shade of white. There's a $40,000 staircase that Steve personally designs. A staircase in a factory. His employees are going crazy. They're like, Steve, we need to ship a product. We need to make money. And Steve's like, it has to be perfect. I read this great quote from one of the early NeXT engineers. He said, Steve believed that if you got all the details right, the product would be obviously superior and people would pay whatever it cost. Notice that word believed, not knew, believed, because here's the thing, Steve didn't actually know if people would pay for perfection. He just believed they would, and that belief was about to get really, really tested. 3 years after starting NeXT, Steve finally launches the computer. October 12, 1988, Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco, huge event, massive production. Steve does his signature keynote, black turtleneck jeans, the whole thing. He unveils the NeXT computer. And it's gorgeous, matte black cube, stunning design. The operating system is years ahead of anything else. It's got this thing called object-oriented programming that makes it easier for developers to write software. The interface is beautiful. It's got a built-in optical drive, super fast for the time. Steve is flying high, the press loves it. Everyone's writing these glowing reviews about how NeXT is the future. Here's the problem, the computer costs $6,500 in 1988 dollars. That's about $16,000 in today's money for a computer. And remember, this is supposed to be for universities. Universities don't have that kind of money. Students definitely don't. The orders don't come in. Months go by, Steve's burning through cash. The automated factory he built, turns out you don't need a $10 million automated factory when you're only selling a few hundred computers a month. They're projected to sell 50,000 units in the first year. They sell 400 computers. This is where most people would panic, pivot, cut costs, not Steve. Steve decides the problem isn't the computer. The problem is that people don't understand the computer, so he makes his engineers keep improving it, make it more perfect, more expensive. 1989, 1990, 1991. The years blur together. NeXT is losing money, lots of money. Steve keeps raising funding. He convinces Canon, the camera company, to invest $100 million. I have no idea how he pulled that off. The NeXT computer still isn't selling. So Steve launches a new model, then another, each one beautiful, each one expensive, each one selling in the hundreds, not thousands. By 1993, NeXT has shipped maybe 50,000 computers total. In comparison, Apple ships 5 million Macs per year. Microsoft is shipping Windows on tens of millions of PCs. Knee XD is irrelevant. Here's what nobody talks about. Steve Jobs is failing, again, not the dramatic public failure of getting fired from Apple, but the slow, grinding failure of building a company that nobody wants to buy from. He's spending his own money now. Lots of it. He's taken $50 million of his own fortune and poured it into Knee XD. I was reading this interview where someone asked Steve about this period and he said, "I was worth about $100 million when I left Apple. By 1993, I was worth maybe $20 million. I'd burned through most of it on Knee XD." Think about that. Steve Jobs, the golden boy of Silicon Valley, the guy on magazine covers, is watching his fortune evaporate in real time. But wait, it gets worse. February 1993, Steve makes a decision that basically everyone tells him is insane. He decides to stop making computers. Completely. Knee XD Computer becomes Knee XD Software. They're going to license the operating system to other computer makers. That's the new plan. The thing is, nobody wants the operating system either. By 1995, Knee XD has maybe 20 customers. The company is on life support. Steve has poured $100 million of his own and investor money into a company that's going nowhere. And this is crucial, there's something happening at Knee XD that nobody's paying attention to yet. The software that Steve's team has built, it's actually really good. The operating system is stable, it's elegant, it's object-oriented, which makes development faster. And a few companies are using it to build really sophisticated software. Including, and this is kind of crazy, Tim Berners-Lee, yeah, the guy who invented the World Wide Web. He built the first web browser and web server on a Knee XD computer. At CERN, the entire World Wide Web was literally created on Knee XD software. Steve doesn't know this yet, but that's going to matter a lot. Okay, so that's Knee XD. That's one half of Steve's wilderness years, but there's another company Steve bought during this time, and honestly, this one might be even crazier. Same year Steve starts Knee XD. He's at a conference and runs into a guy named Ed Catmull. Ed runs the computer graphics division at Lucasfilm. Yeah, George Lucas's company. They've got this team of animators and engineers who are using computers to make graphics for movies. Revolutionary stuff, but Lucas is going through a divorce and needs cash, so he's selling off parts of the company. Ed tells Steve about what they're working on: computer animation, digital effects, the future of filmmaking, and Steve is intrigued, not because he loves movies, but because he sees it as another way to push technology forward. Steve offers to buy the division for $5 million. Lucas wants $10 million. They settle on $5 million plus $5 million in capital for the company. Steve writes the check. The company is called Pixar. Now here's what's funny. Steve didn't buy Pixar to make movies. He bought it to sell computers. Pixar was making this high-end computer called the Pixar Image Computer. It cost $125,000. It was designed for hospitals to use for medical imaging or for government agencies to use for processing imagery. Very niche, very expensive. Sound familiar? Yeah, Steve is doing the exact same thing he's doing with Knee XD, building expensive, beautiful products that nobody buys. The Pixar Image Computer sells maybe 300 units total. It's a disaster. But the animation team at Pixar, led by this guy John Lasseter, they keep making these short films. These little animated demos to show off what the computer can do, and these shorts are incredible. There's one called Luxo Jr., about a desk lamp. It's 2 minutes long, and it gets nominated for an Academy Award. Steve's not paying attention to this. He's focused on selling computers, but the animation team keeps pushing. They want to make a feature film, a full-length animated movie made entirely on computers. Nobody's ever done that before. Steve thinks it's a distraction, but by 1990, Knee XD is consuming all his time and money, and Pixar is barely alive. He's poured $50 million of his own money into Pixar. $50 million, and it's worth basically nothing. I read this great story in 1990. Steve calls a meeting with the Pixar team. He's thinking about shutting it down, just closing the doors. He can't keep funding it, and John Lasseter makes this desperate pitch. He says, "Steve, just give us one more chance. Let us make a movie, a real movie. We can partner with a studio." Steve's skeptical, but Lasseter shows him these animation tests they've been working on. It's a story about toys that come to life when people aren't looking. Steve watches, and for the first time in years, he sees something special. "Fine," Steve says, "but you need to get a deal with a studio. If you can get Disney to partner with us, I'll fund it." Pixar signs a deal with Disney to make 3 movies. The first one is going to be called Toy Story. Now, Disney is not giving Pixar a good deal. They're going to own the movies. Pixar gets a small percentage of the profits, but Steve doesn't care. At this point, he just needs Pixar to survive. And here's what's wild. While Steve is watching Knee XD slowly die, while he's pouring money into Pixar with no return, while his reputation is taking hit after hit, Apple is dying too. Let me paint you a picture of Apple in the early 1990s. It's bad. John Sculley, the guy who beat Steve in that power struggle, is still CEO. Apple's stock is doing okay, they're selling Macs, but they're making weird decisions. They're licensing the Mac operating system to other companies. They're making printers, they're making digital cameras. They're doing all this random stuff instead of focusing on making great computers. Sculley gets pushed out. The board replaces him with Michael Spindler. Spindler's nickname inside Apple is the Diesel because he works all the time. But working hard isn't the same as working smart. Under Spindler, Apple tries to sell itself to IBM, then to Sun Microsystems, then to Philips. Nobody wants them. The stock crashes, the product line is a mess. They've got too many models of Macintosh. Nobody knows which one to buy. The computers keep getting worse, buggier, slower. The board fires Spindler. They bring in Gil Amelio. Now, Gil is a turnaround specialist. He saved National Semiconductor. The board thinks he can save Apple, but when Gil gets there and looks at the books, he realizes it's worse than anyone knew. Apple is losing over $1 billion per year, not million, billion. And the operating system, the thing that makes a Mac, it's ancient. It's held together with duct tape and prayers. Apple's been trying to build a new operating system for 8 years. The project is called Copland. They've spent $500 million on it, and it doesn't work. It crashes constantly. It's years behind schedule. Gil realizes he needs to buy an operating system from someone else, fast. December 1996. Gil is considering two options. There's a company called B Inc., run by a former Apple executive named Jean-Louis Gasset. They've got an operating system. It's decent. Gasset wants $400 million for it. Then there's NeXT, Steve Jobs' company, the one that's been limping along for 11 years. They've got an operating system too, and honestly it's better, more stable, more sophisticated. But buying NeXT means bringing Steve Jobs back into Apple, and Gil knows that's complicated. Gil meets with Steve, December 10, 1996. They meet at the Garden Court Hotel in Palo Alto, neutral territory. Gil's nervous. He's heard all the stories about Steve, the intensity, the perfectionism, the temper. Steve walks in. He's 41 now, still wearing the same black turtleneck and jeans, still intense, but something's different. He's quieter, more measured. 11 years of getting humbled will do that to you. They talk for hours. Steve demos the NeXT operating system, shows Gil what it can do, and Gil is impressed, really impressed. This is exactly what Apple needs. Steve says he'll sell NeXT to Apple for $400 million, same price Gasset wants, but Steve has one condition. He wants to be involved, not as CEO. He doesn't want that job, but as an advisor. He wants to help Apple integrate the technology. Gil thinks about it. $400 million is a lot of money for a company that's almost dead, but Apple is desperate, and Steve's operating system is legitimately the best option. December 20th, 1996, the deal is announced. Apple is acquiring NeXT for $429 million. Steve Jobs is coming back to Apple as an advisor. Now, here's what the press doesn't realize at the time. This isn't just a technology acquisition. This is Steve Jobs positioning himself for a takeover. He doesn't want to be an advisor. He wants his company back. But he's smart about it. He's patient. He's learned from his mistakes in 1985. He's not going to rush in and try to stage another coup. He's going to wait, watch, let Gil fail, and then make his move. I know this sounds cynical, but I read these interviews with people who were at Apple during this time, and they all say the same thing. Steve knew exactly what he was doing. January 1997, Steve returns to Apple. It's been 12 years since they kicked him out. He's got an office. He's technically an advisor, but he's watching everything, sitting in on meetings, giving opinions, and slowly, quietly, he's building alliances with board members. Gil is struggling. Apple is still losing money. The stock is still falling. And Steve is always there in the background, reminding everyone that he built this company, that he knows how to fix it. March 1997, Apple announces they lost $740 million in the first quarter. The board is freaking out. July 9, 1997, the board meets. They're done with Gil. They want him out, and they want Steve Jobs to be interim CEO, not permanent, interim, just until they find someone else. Steve says yes, but he has conditions. He wants to redo the board, bring in his own people. He wants complete operational control, no interference, and he wants $1 per year in salary. He doesn't want them to think he's doing this for money. The board agrees. Gil Amelio is out. Steve Jobs is now interim CEO of Apple. And on his first day back as CEO, Steve walks into a meeting with Apple's executive team, most of whom were there when he got kicked out in 1985, and he says this: "We're going to simplify, we're going to focus, we're going to kill everything that doesn't matter, and we're going to make insanely great products again." Within 2 weeks, Steve fires 3,000 employees, 30% of the company gone. He kills 70% of Apple's products. 70%. All the printers, the random peripherals, the weird licensing deals, the 15 different models of Macintosh. He cuts it all. He's left with 4 products: 4, professional desktop, consumer desktop, professional laptop, consumer laptop. That's it. The executive team is horrified. They think Steve's destroying the company. Board members are getting phone calls from worried employees, but Steve doesn't care. He's done being nice. He's done compromising. August 6, 1997, Steve gives his first major presentation as returning CEO, Macworld Boston. The place is packed. Everyone wants to see if Steve's still got it. Steve takes the stage, black turtleneck, jeans, and he delivers one of the greatest corporate turnaround speeches in history. He talks about Apple's problems, the lack of focus, the bad products, the arrogance, and then he says something that shocks everyone. We need to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. A huge screen behind him lights up, and on it is a live video feed of Bill freaking Gates, at a Microsoft office, smiling. The crowd boos. They're booing Bill Gates, but Steve calms them down, and he announces that Microsoft is investing $150 million in Apple. They're going to develop Microsoft Office for Mac. They're going to support Apple. Now let me explain why this is brilliant. Apple is dying. Nobody wants to develop software for Mac because they think the company's going to disappear. But if Microsoft, the biggest software company in the world, is committing to Mac, it sends a signal. It says Apple's going to survive. Steve knew this. He called Bill personally and pitched him on the investment. And Bill agreed because, honestly, Microsoft didn't want Apple to die either. They needed competition to avoid antitrust problems. But the public doesn't know that. The public just sees that Steve Jobs convinced Microsoft to save Apple. It's genius positioning. Wait, it gets better. November 1997, Steve does something nobody expects. Remember Pixar, the animation company Steve's been funding for 11 years, the one he's poured $50 million into? Toy Story came out in November 1995, 2 years earlier. It made $373 million at the box office. It was the highest-grossing film of 1995. And now, in 1997, Steve takes Pixar public. The IPO values Pixar at $1.5 billion. Steve owns 80% of it. That means Steve Jobs just became worth $1.2 billion. Think about that. In 1985, he was worth $200 million. By 1993, he'd burned through most of it and was down to maybe $20 million. And now, in 1997, he's a billionaire. And it didn't come from NXT, it came from Pixar, the company he almost shut down, the distraction that saved him. Honestly, this is one of the most insane financial comebacks in history. Steve went from rich to broke to billionaire in 12 years. But here's the thing, the money doesn't matter to Steve anymore. I know that sounds like something rich people say to sound humble, but it's actually true for Steve. What matters is Apple. That's his obsession. That's his legacy. And now that he's back, now that he has control, he's going to do something nobody expects. He's going to make Apple cool again. August 1998, Steve launches the iMac, and it's unlike anything anyone's seen. Picture this, for the last 10 years, every computer has been the same. Beige box, boring, rectangular, looks like office equipment. The iMac is a translucent blue and white dome. It looks like it came from the future. It's playful, it's friendly, it's got a handle on top. A handle so you can carry your desktop computer around. Tech reviewers don't know what to make of it. Some love it, some hate it, but everyone's talking about it, and that's what Steve wants. He wants people to care about Apple again. The iMac launches in August 1998. It sells 800,000 units in the first 5 months. Apple's first profitable quarter in years happens in Q4 1998. Steve did it. He actually did it. 12 years after getting kicked out, he came back and saved the company. But I want to go back to something, because there's a lesson here that's easy to miss. Between 1985 and 1997, Steve Jobs failed. A lot. NXT was a commercial disaster. It never made money. It never gained market share. As a computer company, it was a complete failure. But the operating system NXT built, that became the foundation of every Apple product you've ever used. macOS, iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, they're all built on NXT operating system. That thing Steve spent hundreds of millions building, that thing that sold maybe 50,000 computers, it powers a company worth $3 trillion. Pixar was a disaster too. For the first 9 years Steve owned it, it lost money every single year. He almost shut it down multiple times, but it became the most successful animation studio in history. It changed the movie industry completely, and it made Steve a billionaire. So here's the question, were NXT and Pixar failures, or were they necessary steps to Steve becoming who he needed to be? I was thinking about this a lot this week, because the Steve Jobs who got fired in 1985 was brilliant but immature. He was arrogant. He couldn't work with people. He thought he was always right, and maybe he usually was, but that didn't matter if nobody would work with him. The Steve Jobs who came back in 1997 was different, still intense, still demanding, but he'd been humbled. He'd watched two companies nearly die, he'd lost most of his fortune. He'd spent 12 years watching Apple succeed without him, then watched it almost fail. And when he came back, he was focused. He knew what mattered, he knew how to prioritize, he knew how to inspire people instead of just demanding perfection. I'm not saying the exile was good for Steve, it clearly wasn't. It was painful, it was humiliating, it cost him a fortune and 12 years of his life. But it made him who he needed to be to save Apple. And here's the thing that blows my mind. If the board hadn't fired Steve in 1985, Apple probably would have failed earlier. Steve was making bad decisions. He was focused on the Macintosh, which wasn't selling. He was fighting with everyone. He was a liability. And if Steve hadn't started NeXT and Pixar, he wouldn't have had anything to come back with. NeXT gave Apple the operating system it desperately needed. Pixar gave Steve the financial security to take the CEO job for $1 per year. The exile saved both Steve and Apple. Let me tell you what happens next, because this is where it gets really interesting. 1998, 1999, 2000. Steve is rebuilding Apple systematically. He simplifies the product line. He focuses on design. He opens the first Apple retail stores. Everyone thinks the stores are a terrible idea. They're convinced Apple will lose money, but Steve knows something they don't. He knows that if people can touch and feel Apple products, they'll want them. Steve launches the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. It's not the first MP3 player, but it's the best, and it changes the music industry completely. Steve launches the iTunes Store. Suddenly you can buy individual songs for 99 cents. No more buying entire CDs. Record labels hate it, but consumers love it. Apple sells 1 million songs in the first week. This is the big one. January 9, 2007. Steve takes the stage at Macworld in San Francisco, and he says, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." He launches the iPhone. And everything changes, not just for Apple, for the entire world. Smartphones, apps, social media, the entire mobile internet revolution. It all starts with the iPhone. By 2011, Apple is the most valuable company in the world. Steve Jobs' net worth is $7 billion. He's on the cover of every magazine. He's the most famous CEO in the world. But here's what people forget. None of it happens without those 12 years in exile. None of it happens without NeXT, without Pixar, without the failures that taught Steve what mattered. Now I want to talk about what we can learn from this, because this isn't just a story about Steve Jobs. This is a framework for understanding failure, resilience, and what it takes to come back from losing everything. First lesson: failure isn't permanent. Steve got fired from the company he started. He was 30 years old. His identity was completely wrapped up in being the founder of Apple, and they kicked him out. Most people would have quit, gone into hiding, but Steve didn't. He started two new companies immediately, NeXT and Pixar. Were they successful? Not really. NeXT was a commercial failure. Pixar almost died multiple times, but Steve kept building. And eventually, those failures became the foundation of his greatest success. Second lesson: the skills you need to start something are different from the skills you need to save something. Steve Jobs of 1985 was a brilliant product visionary, but a terrible manager. He couldn't work with people, he couldn't compromise, he couldn't prioritize. Those 12 years in exile forced him to learn those skills. He had to learn how to manage people at NeXT and Pixar. He had to learn how to make hard decisions about what to cut. He had to learn humility. And when he came back to Apple, he had the complete skill set he needed. Third lesson: sometimes your backup plan becomes your main plan. Steve bought Pixar as a side project, a distraction. He almost shut it down multiple times, but it ended up being the thing that made him a billionaire and gave him the financial freedom to take risks at Apple. You never know which of your projects is going to pay off, so you have to keep multiple bets alive. Fourth lesson, and this is the big one: focus is everything. When Steve came back to Apple in 1997, the company had dozens of products. He cut it down to four products. Everyone thought he was crazy, but that focus is what saved the company. Instead of spreading resources across dozens of mediocre products, they poured everything into making 4 insanely great products. That's the framework Steve used for the rest of his life. Do fewer things, but do them better than anyone else. Fifth lesson: taste matters more than technology. The NeXT computer was technologically superior to everything else on the market, but it failed because it was too expensive and nobody understood why they needed it. The iMac was technologically inferior to many PCs, but it succeeded because it looked amazing and people wanted it. Steve learned that you can't just build great technology. You have to build things people desire. That's why Apple products became fashion items, not just tools. Sixth lesson: you can't do it alone. Early Steve Jobs thought he could do everything himself, make every decision, design every product. But when he came back, he built an incredible team: Jony Ive for design, Tim Cook for operations, Phil Schiller for marketing. Steve was still the visionary, still the decision maker, but he learned to trust brilliant people to execute his vision. Seventh lesson: timing is everything. Steve tried to revolutionize computing in 1985 with the Macintosh. It was too early, not enough power, too expensive, not enough software. But when he launched the iPhone in 2007, the timing was perfect. Mobile networks were fast enough, screens were good enough, components were cheap enough. Sometimes you have the right idea at the wrong time, and you have to be patient enough to wait for the world to catch up. Okay, so why does this matter right now? Why am I telling you about something that happened 25 to 40 years ago? Because look at what's happening in tech right now. You've got founders getting fired from companies they started. You've got companies that were worth billions going bankrupt. You've got entrepreneurs losing everything and having to start over. And everyone's asking the same question Steve Jobs had to ask in 1985. What do I do now? Look at Sam Altman, November 2023. He gets fired from OpenAI, the company he built. The board votes him out. Everyone thinks it's over. 4 days later, he's back. The board reverses their decision. But here's the thing, Sam spent those 4 days building alliances, talking to investors, preparing his next move. He didn't panic. He strategized. That's the Steve Jobs framework. Look at Travis Kalanick. He built Uber into a $70 billion company. Then he got pushed out by investors, forced to resign as CEO. Did he quit? No, he started Cloud Kitchens, a ghost kitchen company. He's applied everything he learned at Uber to a new industry. That's the Steve Jobs framework. Look at Elon Musk in 2008. Tesla and SpaceX were both almost bankrupt. He had to choose which company to save. He chose both, put his last $40 million into them. People thought he was insane. Now Tesla's worth $800 billion and SpaceX is worth $150 billion. That's the Steve Jobs framework. All in, no backup plan. The lesson isn't that you should get fired. The lesson is that if you do get fired, if you do fail, if you do lose everything, it doesn't mean you're done. It means you're in the middle of your story, not at the end. Here's the thing about Steve's story that I keep coming back to. The 12 years between getting fired and coming back weren't wasted years. They were necessary years. Steve needed to fail at NXT to understand what mattered. He needed to almost lose Pixar to appreciate the value of persistence. He needed to watch Apple almost die to understand what he would do differently. Those 12 years in the wilderness were the price he paid for wisdom. I think a lot about what would have happened if Steve had never gotten fired. Would Apple have become what it is today? Probably not. The Steve Jobs of 1985 wasn't ready to build a trillion-dollar company. He was ready to build a cool product company. But cool product companies don't become Apple. They become niche brands with passionate fans but limited reach. Steve needed to fail. He needed to be humbled. He needed to learn that vision without execution is hallucination, that perfection without pragmatism is bankruptcy, that being right doesn't matter if nobody follows you. And when he finally learned those lessons, when he finally became the complete leader Apple needed, he built something unprecedented. Not just a successful company, a company that changed how humans interact with technology, how we listen to music, how we use phones, how we think about design. But it took 12 years of exile to get there. Let me tell you one more story, then I'll wrap this up. October 2003, Steve Jobs gets diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He keeps it secret for 9 months, doesn't tell anyone except his closest family. He tries to treat it with alternative medicine, diet changes, acupuncture. He refuses surgery. His doctors are begging him to get the surgery. It's a rare form of pancreatic cancer, actually treatable if caught early. But Steve is stubborn. He thinks he can beat it his way. Finally, in July 2004, he has the surgery. They remove the tumor. He takes a few months off. Then he comes back to Apple and keeps working. He gives the commencement speech at Stanford, and he talks about getting fired from Apple. He says, "I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life." Think about that. The best thing that ever happened to him was getting fired. That's what Steve believed, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. The cancer comes back. 2008, 2009, 2010. Steve gets sicker. He has a liver transplant. He keeps working, keeps launching products. The iPad in 2010. He's frail, he's thin, but he won't stop. August 24, 2011, Steve resigns as CEO of Apple. He makes Tim Cook CEO. 6 weeks later, October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs dies. He's 56 years old. And here's what's remarkable. At the moment of his death, Apple is the most valuable company in the world. The iPhone is the best-selling product in history. Steve Jobs has achieved everything he set out to achieve. He proved that he wasn't just the guy who started Apple. He was the guy who saved it, who transformed it, who turned it into the greatest company ever built. But none of it happens without 1985. None of it happens without getting fired, without starting NXT, without buying Pixar, without 12 years of failure and frustration and learning. The exile made the king. So here's what I keep thinking about. We celebrate success. We study successful companies. We interview successful founders. But we don't talk enough about the failures that made that success possible. The years of grinding, the companies that almost died, the moments of doubt and fear and desperation. Steve Jobs spent 12 years in the wilderness, 12 years of failure and humiliation and financial stress. and those 12 years were the price he paid to become the person who could save Apple. Most people don't survive 12 years of failure. They quit after one, after two, they get discouraged, they change careers, they give up on their vision. But the people who make it, the ones who build billion-dollar companies, they don't quit, they keep building, they learn from every failure, they compound their knowledge, and eventually, if they're lucky, if they're persistent, if they're willing to pay the price, they get their shot. Steve got his shot in 1997, and he didn't waste it. That's the lesson, that's what I want you to take from this. If you're in your wilderness years right now, if you've been fired or your company failed or you're struggling to get traction, it doesn't mean you're done. It means you're in the middle of your story. And if you keep building, if you keep learning, if you stay focused on what matters, your shot will come. Maybe not in 12 years, maybe sooner, maybe later, but it'll come. And when it does, you'll be ready because you paid the price, you learned the lessons, you became the person who could handle success. That's what Steve Jobs did, that's what every great founder does. They survive their wilderness years and they come back stronger. Alright, so that's the story. That's how Steve Jobs went from getting fired at 30 to saving Apple at 42. That's how 12 years of failure created the foundation for the greatest corporate turnaround in history. The exile made the king, the failure made the success, the wilderness years made the legend. And if you're in your wilderness years right now, remember this. Steve Jobs spent 12 years building companies that failed, pouring his fortune into projects that lost money, working in obscurity while the world moved on. And then he came back and changed everything. Your turn is coming, keep building. So that's the deep dive on Steve Jobs' 12 years in exile. That's the story most people skip over. The failure years, the wilderness years, the years that actually mattered most. Look, if this kind of research is valuable to you, if you want to understand how these companies were actually built, not the sanitized version but the real story with all the failure and struggle and doubt, hit that subscribe button. I release new episodes every single day, deep dives into the decisions that built billion-dollar companies, the strategies that worked, the mistakes that almost destroyed everything. Tomorrow's episode, another founder, another near-death moment, another set of decisions that changed everything. I'm Alex Morgan, thanks for listening to Behind the Billion.